I drove 4 hours through a blinding Colorado blizzard with my 5-year-old son shivering in the back seat, only to have my own mother crack the front door of our family cabin and tell me to go home because there was no room left. I stood on the freezing porch, clutching my sleeping child, while she told me my brother needed his space. So I turned around and left. But 15 minutes later, my phone rang, and what my grandmother did next left my parents and my golden child brother completely speechless. My name is Nia, and I am 32 years old. Before I tell you how my family's perfect Christmas turned into a living nightmare, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who thought they could treat you like an outcast. The drive up the mountain to Aspen had been treacherous. Snow was falling so heavily that my windshield wipers could barely keep up, and my hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel. In the back seat, my son Leo was bundled in his heavy winter coat fast asleep, oblivious to the dangerous roads. We were heading to the annual Christmas gathering at my grandmother Estelle's luxury mountain lodge. It was supposed to be a time of joy and connection, but in my family, gatherings were usually just a stage for my mother Vivian to show off. My mother is the kind of woman who measures a person's worth by their zip code and their social club memberships. She is a proud fixture in the local Black elite circles in Atlanta, a prominent member of high society who never lets anyone forget her status. To her, I was the ultimate disappointment. I am a single mother and a forensic accountant. While I am incredibly proud of the career I built from the ground up, my family considers my job to be nothing more than a glorified calculator. They do not understand that I spend my days tracking down hidden millions and dismantling corporate fraud. To them, I am just the family embarrassment who failed to secure a wealthy husband. When I finally pulled into the long, winding driveway of the lodge, I felt a massive wave of relief. The massive log cabin was glowing with warm golden light against the dark, snowy evening. I unbuckled Leo, who was rubbing his sleepy eyes, and carried him up the heavy stone steps. I rang the doorbell, eager to get us out of the biting wind. The heavy oak door opened just a few inches. My mother stood there holding a crystal glass of red wine, wearing a perfectly tailored cashmere sweater. She did not open the door wide to welcome us. She just looked at me, and then at Leo, with a tight, strained smile. She told me I had terrible timing. She said there simply was no room left in the lodge for us. I stared at her in absolute shock, reminding her that this trip had been planned for months, and that the lodge had 8 distinct bedrooms. My mother sighed heavily, as if my very existence was an exhausting burden. She explained that my older brother, MJ, and his wife, Chloe, needed the master suite and the adjoining rooms for their privacy and their extensive luggage. MJ is 35 years old and the undisputed golden child of the family. He is the CEO of a tech startup, and in my parents' eyes, he is a brilliant visionary who can do absolutely no wrong. They practically worship the ground he walks on, constantly funding his lavish lifestyle while ignoring my achievements entirely. Behind my mother, I could see Chloe walking through the warm foyer. Chloe comes from a wealthy white family with old money, and she has spent the last 5 years making sure I know my place. She smiled her typical passive-aggressive smile and called out, saying it was such a shame I did not plan ahead to book a hotel in town. She added with a sickening sweetness that it was probably for the best anyway, since loud children would ruin the quiet luxury vibe they were going for this holiday. She looked at my simple winter coat and my sleeping son as if we were unwanted delivery drivers who had shown up at the wrong address. My mother nodded in agreement, telling me to just drive back down the mountain and find a motel. She actually told me to leave my 5-year-old son in a blizzard on Christmas Eve so her favorite child and his entitled wife could have extra closet space. My father, Richard Sr., was sitting in the living room right behind them, staring at the fireplace. He looked away deliberately, refusing to meet my eyes. He has always been an enabler, preferring to keep the peace with my mother rather than stand up for his daughter. He muttered something under his breath about how I always managed to make things complicated and ruin the festive mood. The betrayal cut so deep, it physically hurt my chest. But I did not cry. I did not beg or scream. I held my son tighter against my shoulder, told my mother to have a Merry Christmas, and turned around. Walking back to my car, the freezing wind bit into my face, but the coldness inside my family's home was far worse. I strapped Leo back into his car seat, wrapped an extra blanket around his small body, and started the engine. The tears only came when I was safely out of their sight, sliding down my cheeks hot and fast as I navigated the dangerous icy roads back toward the town. I felt a crushing sense of isolation, wondering why I constantly tried to win the love of people who clearly viewed me as entirely disposable. I had been driving for about 15 minutes, carefully guiding my car through the heavy snowdrifts, when my phone suddenly lit up the dark cabin of the car. It was my grandmother, Estelle. I hesitated for a moment, wiping my face with the back of my hand, clearing my throat before answering. Grandmother Estelle is a formidable force of nature. She grew up with absolutely nothing and built a massive real estate empire through pure grit and relentless determination. She despises the superficial high society games my mother plays and has always seen right through MJ's flashy facade. When I answered the phone, her voice was sharp and commanding, demanding to know where I was and why my car was not parked in the driveway. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the raw emotion leaked through. I told her that Mom said there was no room for us because MJ and Chloe needed the space for their things. I told her we were heading back to town to find a cheap motel for the night, hoping the roads would not ice over completely. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then I heard a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a low, dangerous growl from a woman who built her life taking disrespect from absolutely no one. She did not ask follow-up questions. She did not offer sweet sympathy. She gave me a direct, unyielding order. Turn that car around right now. The tires of my SUV gripped the icy asphalt as I whipped the steering wheel hard, pulling a sharp turn in the middle of the desolate mountain road. The heater was blasting at maximum capacity, but the chill in my bones had absolutely nothing to do with the Colorado blizzard raging outside. It took 12 agonizing minutes to navigate back up the steep, winding driveway to the lodge. The snow was falling so thick it looked like a solid white wall, but the fire burning inside me provided all the clarity I needed. I unbuckled Leo for the second time that night, wrapping his favorite fleece blanket around him, and carried him up the heavy stone steps. When I pushed the thick oak front door open, the scene unfolding in the grand foyer was nothing short of cinematic. My grandmother, Estelle, stood at the very top of the grand wooden staircase, leaning heavily on her polished ebony cane. She was 78 years old, a woman who had clawed her way up from absolute poverty to build a massive real estate empire across the South. She wore a simple silk robe, but her presence commanded the room like a general. She despised superficiality, and right now she was looking down at my brother MJ and his wife Chloe with a level of absolute disgust that could freeze boiling water. Before I could even brush the snow off Leo's coat, a massive leather designer suitcase came tumbling down the stairs. It hit the slate floor with a loud crack, popping open and spilling expensive ski gear across the entryway. Chloe let out a high-pitched shriek, pressing her manicured hands against her face in horror. Grandma Estelle stood tall at the landing, her voice booming through the cavernous lodge and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She pointed the tip of her ebony cane directly at MJ's chest. "Pack your things," she ordered, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "You and your wife are moving to the small guest room at the end of the hall. The master suite belongs to Nia and my great-grandson." MJ's mouth dropped open in shock. He looked frantically toward my parents for help, but my mother Vivian was frozen by the fireplace, clutching her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Chloe, however, was not going to take this humiliation quietly. Chloe comes from old money, the kind of generational wealth that makes people think they can buy respect and bulldoze anyone in their path. For the past 5 years, she had perfected the art of the microaggression toward me. She was the type of woman who would buy my son cheap plastic toys for his birthday, while flaunting $1,000 gadgets for her own nephews, always batting her innocent blue eyes and claiming she thought I preferred humble gifts. But right now, the innocent act was entirely gone. Her face turned a furious, blotchy shade of red as she stared up at the woman who actually owned the roof over her head. "You cannot possibly be serious," Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the timber walls. "We need the master suite for my ski equipment and my wardrobe. I am not staying in a cramped guest room like some kind of commoner. We are the guests of honor." Grandma Estelle slowly descended the stairs, each heavy tap of her cane sounding like a judge's gavel striking wood. "Then you can pack your bags and find a hotel down in Aspen," she replied with chilling calmness. "But in my house, a single mother and a 5-year-old child will never be sent out into a dangerous blizzard, while an able-bodied couple hoards a king-sized bed. You will move your things immediately, or you will sleep in your car. My house, my rules." Chloe spun around violently looking for MJ to defend her, but the so-called brilliant CEO, the golden child of the family, was uncharacteristically silent. He stared at his expensive Italian loafers, completely unwilling to make eye contact with his grandmother. He knew better than to cross Estelle when her mind was made up. Furious and humiliated, Chloe stomped her foot like a petulant toddler, threatening to call her wealthy parents right that instant to send a private car to rescue them from this nightmare. I stood quietly near the entryway, holding a sleepy Leo against my chest, simply watching the chaotic performance unfold. I did not say a single word. That was when my father, Richard Sr., finally stepped forward from the shadows of the living room. He did not reprimand his daughter-in-law for her disrespectful tantrum. He did not check on his shivering grandson to see if he was safe from the storm. Instead, he turned his gaze entirely on me. His eyes were cold, filled with a toxic resentment that had been brewing ever since I refused to be the submissive, quiet daughter they desperately wanted me to be. "You always love ruining this family's happiness, do you not?" He hissed, his voice low and dripping with absolute venom. "You just could not let your brother have one peaceful holiday. You had to go crying to your grandmother and cause a massive scene." The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the heavy cabin air. I had literally been driving away in a deadly snowstorm, submitting to their cruel demands until I was ordered back by the matriarch of the family. But in my father's eyes, I would always be the villain of their perfect story. I looked at him, seeing the weak, enabling man hiding behind a facade of elite respectability. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not defend my actions or try to explain the truth. I simply shifted Leo's weight in my arms, adjusting his blanket so he could rest his head comfortably on my shoulder. I looked my father dead in the eye, offered him a polite, chilling smile, and walked right past him. I stepped carefully over Chloe's discarded designer luggage, ignoring her dramatic sobbing, and walked straight up the grand staircase toward the warmth of the master suite. The absolute silence I left in my wake was louder and more powerful than any screaming match could ever be. The warmth of the bourbon burned the back of my throat as I leaned back in my leather chair. My mind drifted from that silent victory on the staircase to the forced festivities of the following morning. Christmas in Aspen was supposed to look like a luxury holiday catalog, with fresh pine garlands, crackling fires, and a massive tree imported from a local farm. But the air inside the lodge was thick with unspoken resentment and bitter tension. Chloe was already orchestrating the morning gift exchange, determined to reassert her dominance after being banished to the guest wing. She sat cross-legged by the glowing tree, wearing a designer silk pajama set, acting like the perfect, generous aunt. For her own nieces and nephews, who had flown in with her parents and were staying at a nearby luxury hotel, she handed out the latest virtual reality headsets and custom-built drones. The room was filled with the sound of tearing expensive wrapping paper and excited cheers. Then she turned to my Leo. She handed him a flimsy, brightly colored paper bag. Inside was a generic, hollow plastic toy car, the kind you buy at a gas station checkout counter for $3. Leo, being a sweet and polite 5-year-old, smiled and said thank you. Chloe looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, putting her hand over her heart. "I know things have been incredibly tight for you lately," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy and calculated pity. "I figured since you are struggling to do it all on your own, he would just be thrilled to have absolutely anything new to play with." The great room went dead silent. My mother sipped her mimosa, pretending not to hear the glaring insult. My father suddenly found the falling snow outside the window very interesting. They were all waiting for me to snap. They wanted me to yell so they could quickly label me the angry, bitter single mother who could not even appreciate a simple holiday gift. I did not give them the satisfaction. Instead, I offered Chloe a calm, tight smile. I knew exactly how to hit back, and I did not need to raise my voice to do it. Earlier that morning, I had been the first one awake, pouring myself a cup of black coffee in the massive chef's kitchen. MJ had left his leather briefcase open on the marble island, alongside a stack of printed quarterly financial reports. He had always been careless, assuming no one in the family understood his highly technical business world. But I am a senior partner specializing in forensic accounting. It took my trained eyes less than 30 seconds to spot the glaring anomalies on the top page. I saw inflated accounts receivable and phantom revenue streams booked in the fourth quarter, clearly designed to hide a massive, catastrophic cash bleed. It was not just aggressive accounting, it was textbook corporate fraud. I walked over to the grand dining table and took my seat. The private chef my parents hired had laid out a lavish breakfast spread. I picked up my heavy silver fork and knife, smoothly slicing into a perfectly poached egg. The yolk spilled over the toast as I looked directly across the length of the table at my brother, MJ. I said, keeping my tone light and entirely conversational. I noticed you left some of your Q4 financial summaries on the kitchen island this morning. I have a quick professional question. Why exactly is your CFO booking uncollected subscription revenue as realized cash for the fourth quarter? Are you guys trying to artificially inflate your valuation ahead of an upcoming audit, or is your accounting department just entirely incompetent? The loud clatter of heavy silver hitting fine china echoed through the dining room. MJ dropped his fork. His hands began to visibly shake. The smug, confident aura of the brilliant tech CEO vanished in a microsecond, replaced by the terrified, empty stare of a man who had just been caught red-handed. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost against the dark wood paneling of the room. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked, panicked stutter came out. Before MJ could even attempt to construct a coherent lie, my mother Vivian swooped in like a protective hawk defending her nest. She slammed her mimosa glass onto the table, sloshing orange juice over the crystal rim. "How dare you bring your jealous interrogations to the Christmas breakfast table, Nia?" She shrieked, her voice echoing sharply. "You have always been completely green with envy over your brother's success. Just because you sit in a cubicle crunching numbers for a living does not give you the right to question a visionary CEO. You know absolutely nothing about running a real company. You are just trying to ruin his special moment because you are miserable with your own choices." I chewed my food slowly, savoring the rich flavor completely unbothered by her screaming. I did not blink, and I did not take my eyes off MJ. He knew. He knew exactly what I had seen, and he knew that I understood exactly what it meant for his freedom and his future. His breathing became shallow and ragged, his chest heaving under his designer sweater. He abruptly pushed his heavy oak chair back from the table, the wood scraping loudly against the floorboards. Without saying a single word to my mother to defend himself or validate her fierce protection, he grabbed Chloe by the arm, hauling her up from the floor. "We have to go," he muttered, his voice tight with pure, unadulterated panic. "I need to make a phone call right now." Chloe stumbled, dropping a piece of shiny wrapping paper, demanding to know what was wrong and why he was grabbing her. But MJ did not answer. He practically dragged his wife out of the dining room and down the long hallway. The heavy thud of the guest room door slamming shut vibrated through the floorboards, leaving the rest of the family sitting in stunned, heavy silence. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter, dark roast wash down, while my mother glared at me, breathing heavily and waiting for an explanation she was never going to get. The lodge was completely engulfed by the midnight blizzard. Outside the massive timber-framed windows, the wind howled like a wounded animal, battering the thick glass with sheets of ice. Inside, the silence was supposed to be absolute. I slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, careful not to wake Leo. His small forehead was warm, and he had been tossing and turning from the dry mountain heat pumping through the vents. He needed water. I wrapped my thick wool cardigan tightly around my shoulders and stepped softly into the darkened hallway. The camera lens of my mind seemed to push forward slowly, tracking my every step as I descended the grand wooden staircase. The glowing embers from the living room fireplace cast long twisting shadows against the mounted antlers and stonework. The house felt entirely asleep. But as I reached the bottom landing and turned toward the massive open concept kitchen, a faint, harsh whisper broke the quiet. It was not coming from the guest wing, it was coming from beneath my feet. The door to the subterranean wine cellar was slightly ajar, spilling a thin sliver of pale yellow light across the reclaimed oak floorboards. The temperature dropped noticeably as I approached, but the chill creeping up my spine had nothing to do with the draft. I pressed my back flat against the cold stone wall beside the heavy iron hinged door, holding my breath. "You are a complete fool, MJ." My father's voice hissed, cutting through the damp cellar air with venomous clarity. "How could you possibly let it get this far without telling us? You are 35 years old, running a tech firm into the ground, and you are acting like a panicked teenager." I peered through the narrow crack. The cellar was lined with thousands of vintage bottles, but my family looked completely out of place among the refined luxury. MJ was pacing frantically between the wooden racks. He had stripped off his designer cashmere sweater, and his dress shirt was soaked with sweat. He was running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, destroying the golden child facade completely. "I had no choice, Dad." MJ's voice was a desperate, high-pitched whine. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep Chloe happy? Her family expects a certain standard of living. When the Series B funding fell through, I had to maintain the image. If her father found out my company was hemorrhaging cash, he would have forced her to file for divorce immediately. I just needed to float the lifestyle for a few quarters until the new software launched." "Floating a lifestyle is buying a leased car, MJ." My mother Vivian snapped, her tone sharp and terrified. "You took investor capital to buy a $400,000 sports car and a diamond tennis bracelet. That is not floating. That is federal fraud. If the SEC or your board members look at those accounts, you are going to prison. Do you understand that?" "Prison? My beautiful boy cannot go to a federal penitentiary." I pressed my hand hard against my mouth to stop the gasp from escaping my throat. My brother, the so-called tech genius, the undisputed pride of the family, was completely bankrupt. He was not just a terrible businessman. He was a criminal. He had embezzled millions of dollars from his own company to fund his wife's extravagant shopping addictions just to keep up appearances with her old money family. And my parents, my critical, judgmental parents who scrutinized my every penny, were not dragging him to the authorities. They were conspiring to cover it up. "What are we going to do?" MJ was practically hyperventilating now, leaning against a wine barrel for support. "The auditors are coming in the second week of January. I tried to bury the missing capital in the fourth quarter revenue projections, but Nia saw the paperwork this morning. You saw her face at breakfast. She is a forensic accountant. She knows exactly what those numbers mean. If she opens her mouth, the board will demand a full investigation before Monday." Vivian slammed her hand against a wooden tasting table. "Forget about your sister for a minute. She is a bitter, resentful woman who has always been jealous of your success. We will handle her. We need a massive injection of liquid cash to replace the missing funds before the auditors arrive. We need at least $4 million to balance those ledgers, MJ. Where exactly are we supposed to get that kind of money in 2 weeks?" The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the faint drip of condensation in the cellar. Then my father spoke. His voice was no longer panicked. It was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of moral hesitation. "We use this lodge." "What are you talking about, Richard?" my mother asked, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "This property in Aspen is completely unencumbered," my father explained, the gears of his terrible plan turning smoothly. "Estelle bought it in cash 20 years ago. The market value right now is easily pushing $6 million. If we can secure a quiet commercial mortgage against the deed, we can pull out the 4 million MJ needs in cash. The tech company rebounds next year, MJ pays off the mortgage quietly, and your mother never even knows there was a lien on her precious mountain retreat. I felt my blood turn to absolute ice. They were planning to steal from my grandmother. Estelle had built her real estate empire through decades of grueling hard work, sacrificing everything to secure generational wealth. This lodge was her pride and joy, and her own son was actively planning to mortgage it out from under her to save his fraudulent, spoiled son. She will never agree to that. Dad, MJ stammered, his voice thick with desperate hope. Grandma hates my business. She thinks tech is a fake industry. She will never sign over the deed for a loan. She does not have to know it is for a loan, my father replied smoothly. Estelle is getting old. Her eyesight is failing. She trusts me to handle the heavy legal paperwork for her estate planning. I can easily draft a general power of attorney that grants me full administrative control over her property portfolio. I will bury it in a stack of routine end-of-year tax documents. She will sign it without reading the fine print. She always does. It was a masterclass in betrayal. I stood in the dark hallway listening to the people who raised me plot a devastating financial crime against their own blood. They were so blinded by their obsession with MJ's status, so terrified of the social humiliation of having a failed son, that they were willing to bankrupt an 80-year-old woman. But what about Nia? My mother's voice cut through the dark, filled with sharp paranoia. Estelle left a provision in the family trust. Any major transfer of the core real estate assets requires the signatures of all adult beneficiaries to waive their future inheritance rights. We need Nia to sign a waiver clearing the title for the bank. MJ groaned loudly. Nia will never sign anything for me. She hates me. She hates Chloe. And after the way Grandma embarrassed Chloe on the stairs tonight, Nia thinks she practically owns this house. My father let out a low, dark chuckle that made my skin crawl. Your sister is predictable, MJ. She operates on emotion and self-righteous pride. We just have to make her believe signing that document is her own idea. We will tell her it is a standard legal release to finalize her independent trust for Leo. We will frame it as her final separation from the family finances. She has been begging for financial independence for years. If we push the right buttons, she will sign it just to prove she does not need our money. But we have to move quickly. My father continued, his voice hardening into a brutal command. We must get that brat Nia's signature on the inheritance waiver first thing tomorrow morning. If she pokes her nose into the actual books, or talks to Estelle before we secure that paperwork, we are entirely doomed. She is the only threat to this plan. We break her confidence, we get the signature, and then we throw her out of this house once and for all. I did not gasp. I did not step back. I stood absolutely perfectly still in the freezing shadows of the hallway. The sheer magnitude of their deception washed over me, stripping away any lingering doubt, any shred of childhood guilt I had ever carried. For 32 years I had internalized their criticism. I had believed I was the difficult child, the ungrateful daughter, the outcast who simply could not measure up to the brilliant MJ. But in the span of 10 minutes, hiding outside a wine cellar, I finally saw the absolute truth. I was not the broken one. I was the only one in this family with a spine. They thought I was predictable. They thought my pride would make me blind to their legal traps. They thought they could manipulate a forensic accountant with a fake trust document and a few insulting remarks. They had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I did not need to confront them in the basement. I did not need to scream or cry or throw a tantrum like Chloe. I had the ultimate weapon now. I had the truth. I knew about the embezzlement. I knew about the fraudulent revenue. I knew about the plot to steal Estelle's lodge. And most importantly, I knew exactly what they were going to do next. I turned away from the cellar door, moving with complete silence across the hardwood floor. I poured a glass of cold water from the kitchen tap for my son, my hands completely steady. I walked back up the grand staircase, leaving the thieves in the basement to scheme their own downfall. I reached the master suite and closed the heavy oak door, locking it securely. I stood in the dark looking out at the raging blizzard, feeling a brilliant, burning calm settle deeply into my chest. my hands clenched into tight, powerful fists. Tomorrow morning, they were going to start a war they had absolutely no idea how to fight. The camera angle shifts slightly, tilting the perspective of the grand living room just enough to make the opulent surroundings feel intensely suffocating and deeply fake. It was the following evening, and the mountain lodge had been transformed into a staging ground for my parents' absolute favorite blood sport: social posturing. They had invited a curated selection of the local Black elite, currently vacationing in Aspen. Surgeons, federal judges, and generational wealth real estate developers filled the room, laughing politely, holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne and pretending they did not notice the toxic undercurrent running through the Wilson family. My mother, Vivian, was in her element. She wore a stunning emerald green gown and glided through the crowd with practiced ease, leading guests toward the massive stone fireplace where my father, Richard Sr., stood shoulder to shoulder with MJ. The golden boy was wearing a bespoke velvet blazer, sweating profusely under the armpits, but forcing a terrifyingly rigid smile. Chloe was practically orbiting him, draped in a silver cocktail dress that plunged dangerously low. But it was not the dress that caught my attention. It was the blinding multi-carat diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. She kept reaching up to touch it, stroking the cold stones, so everyone in the room would notice the sheer expense. I watched her fingers trace the diamonds, knowing with absolute mathematical certainty that those jewels were bought with stolen corporate funds. I stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, keeping a watchful eye on Leo, who was quietly coloring at a small side table. I knew exactly why my parents had thrown this lavish gathering. It was a pressure cooker. They wanted to publicly elevate MJ as the supreme patriarch in training, while simultaneously breaking my spirit in front of an audience of highly influential peers. They needed me, compliant, submissive, and emotionally exhausted, so I would blindly sign the inheritance waiver they had slipped under my bedroom door that morning. I had the fraudulent document folded neatly inside my clutch purse right at that very moment. "May I have your attention, please?" my father announced, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The low murmur of the elite crowd faded into expectant silence. "I want to take a moment to welcome all of our dear friends and to celebrate the true meaning of family. As you know, this has been a banner year for my son MJ. His tech firm is revolutionizing the industry, and his brilliant leadership makes his mother and me burst with pride every single day." The crowd offered a round of warm, enthusiastic applause. MJ raised his glass, his hands trembling so violently that a few drops of champagne spilled onto the polished floor. "But family is not just about celebrating the peaks," my mother interjected smoothly, stepping forward to slide her arm through my father's. "It is also about carrying the ones we love through the valleys." She turned her gaze directly toward me, ensuring every single pair of eyes in the room followed her line of sight. "As many of you know, our sweet Nia is still struggling to find her path. Being a single mother is so incredibly challenging, and her little accounting job barely keeps her afloat. We brought her here this Christmas because we strongly believe that those who have been blessed with success like MJ must shelter and protect the vulnerable members of the flock. We have to completely support her and little Leo until she finally figures out what she is doing with her life." The collective pity in the room was a physical weight. Women in designer dresses offered me sympathetic, tight-lipped smiles. Men murmured low sounds of approval at my parents' profound generosity. They were looking at me like a charity case, a tragic cautionary tale of failed potential standing in the shadow of a corporate titan. Chloe let out an audible, theatrical sigh of sympathy, pressing her hand against the stolen diamonds on her chest and offering me a look of pure, unadulterated venom disguised as pity. They waited for me to crumble. They expected me to look down at my shoes, to flush bright red with shame, to shrink into the heavy timber walls. I did absolutely none of those things. I stood tall, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water, and offered my mother a smile so terrifyingly serene that it caused her confident posture to visibly falter. I did not need to defend my senior partnership or my six-figure forensic accounting salary to these people. Let them believe the lie. Let my parents build a house of cards right in the middle of a blizzard. It only meant the inevitable collapse would be that much more spectacular. I excused myself from the perimeter and waded directly into the center of the crowd. I was not going to hide. As I approached the main bar, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair at his temples turned to greet me. I recognized him instantly from my industry circles. Marcus Vance, a senior partner at a premier investment bank in Chicago. He was an old golfing buddy of my father, but his firm handled corporate acquisitions, not personal wealth management. Nia Marcus smiled warmly, extending a hand. It has been years. Your mother tells me you are still doing bookkeeping. If you ever need a recommendation for a solid mid-level firm in the city, you just let me know. I shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Marcus. But actually, my firm handles deep-dive forensic audits. I specialize in identifying corporate embezzlement and phantom revenue streams ahead of hostile takeovers. Marcus raised a thick eyebrow, completely abandoning his patronizing tone. Forensic audits. That is a brutal sector right now. In fact, you must be following the absolute bloodbath happening in the mid-tier tech space. I swirled the ice in my glass, keeping my voice pitched perfectly level. It is certainly a volatile quarter. Speaking of tech, I hear MJ's sector is facing some aggressive restructuring. Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, completely unaware that he was holding a lit match over a barrel of gasoline. Aggressive is an understatement. I probably should not say this since it is your brother, but the financial circles in Chicago are buzzing today. MJ's firm just had a massive shift. A shadow private equity group, completely anonymous, just swooped in and bought out every single dime of his company's toxic debt. I stopped swirling my glass. Bought his debt, I asked, maintaining absolute composure. Swallowed it whole. Marcus nodded, taking a sip of his scotch. Millions of dollars in leveraged liabilities wiped off the public books and transferred to a private holding company in less than 24 hours. Your brother no longer owes a dozen random creditors, Nia. He owes one single faceless entity, and they now own him entirely. I have seen these shadow firms operate. They do not buy bad debt out of the goodness of their hearts. They buy it to completely liquidate the current management and seize the underlying assets. I hope to God he knows what he is doing, because whoever bought that paper is preparing to gut him alive. A sharp, agonizing sound resembling a dying animal choking on air erupted from directly behind me. I turned slowly. MJ was standing less than 2 feet away. He had clearly stepped away from the fireplace to eavesdrop on my conversation, hoping to catch me complaining about my mother's humiliating speech. Instead, he had walked straight into a psychological landmine. His face was no longer pale. It was a sickening shade of gray. His eyes were wide and completely bloodshot, staring wildly at Marcus. The crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from his trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the mahogany bar and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending sharp shards of glass and expensive liquor spraying across Chloe's silver heels. Chloe screamed, jumping back and swatting at her dress. MJ, what is wrong with you? She yelled, oblivious to the absolute terror radiating from her husband. My mother and father rushed over, pushing through the wealthy guests who were now backing away from the sudden chaos. Vivian grabbed MJ's shoulder, her face masked with fake polite concern for the audience. MJ, darling, did you have a dizzy spell? The altitude in Aspen can be so unforgiving. MJ did not look at his mother. He did not look at his wife. He stared directly at me. He was breathing so fast he was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling in erratic, desperate jerks. The realization was hitting him with the force of a freight train. He could not cover up the missing funds anymore. He could not trick our grandmother into signing a mortgage to pay off his creditors because the creditors were gone. The debt had been weaponized and consolidated by an entity that would immediately audit the books and discover the millions he had stolen for Chloe's diamonds and cars. And looking into my eyes, he knew with absolute certainty that I understood exactly what this meant. He was not just facing bankruptcy, he was facing federal prison. I offered my brother a tiny, razor-sharp smile. Careful, MJ. I whispered softly, ensuring only he could hear the fatal blow. The higher you climb, the harder you shatter. He stumbled backward, pulling violently out of my mother's grasp, and bolted toward the hallway, leaving the elite crowd staring in absolute bewildered silence. The last of the elite guests practically sprinted for the coat check. The sound of MJ shattering crystal and fleeing the great room was the social equivalent of a fire alarm. In less than 20 minutes, the sweeping driveway was entirely empty of luxury SUVs, leaving behind a deafening silence inside the lodge. I was wiping a smudge of spilled champagne from my heel when the heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was my father. His grip was entirely devoid of any paternal warmth, biting painfully into my collarbone. "We are going to the library," Richard Sr. commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying suppressed rage. "Now!" He did not wait for my response. He practically marched me down the long, dimly lit corridor toward the back of the house. My mother and MJ followed closely behind us, moving like a synchronized execution squad. MJ was still trembling, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his velvet sleeve. Vivian's emerald gown swept across the floorboards, her breathing heavy and jagged. My father shoved me through the arched doorway of the grand library. The room was a windowless, soundproofed vault lined from floor to ceiling with dark walnut bookshelves and smelling faintly of stale cigar smoke and old paper. As soon as my mother and MJ crossed the threshold, my father slammed the heavy door shut. The sharp metallic click of the brass deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. I walked to the center of the Persian rug and stopped. They immediately surrounded me. My father stood directly in front of me, blocking my path to the door. Vivian flanked my left, while MJ paced frantically on my right. They stood tall, attempting to use their physical presence to push me down, to make me feel small and trapped beneath their towering shadows. It was a calculated intimidation tactic straight out of my father's corporate playbook. But I refused to sink into the heavy leather armchair behind me. I locked my knees, straightened my spine, and forced them to meet me squarely, eye to eye. My father reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He slammed the documents down onto the center of the mahogany desk separating us. "Sign this," he ordered. His voice was no longer the smooth, charismatic baritone he used with his wealthy friends. It was a brutal, uncompromising bark. "Waive your rights to this lodge and your grandmother's other trusts. Let your brother manage everything." I looked down at the documents. The bold, capitalized font at the top read "Irrevocable Waiver of Inheritance Rights and Transfer of Administrative Power." It was exactly what I had heard them plotting in the wine cellar. They wanted me to legally forfeit my entire future so they could use Estelle's pristine real estate portfolio as collateral to bail out a criminal. "You are out of your mind," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "I am not signing away my son's future so you can cover up a federal crime." MJ let out a panicked, whimpering sound. "He knows, Dad. She knows everything. I told you she was looking at the quarterly reports. She knows about the missing capital." "Shut up, MJ," my mother hissed, turning her fierce glare back to me. "You do not know what you are talking about, Nia. Your brother's company is going through a temporary cash flow transition. That is all." "A transition," I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "He embezzled millions of dollars to buy diamonds for a woman who will leave him the second his bank accounts freeze. And now, some anonymous private equity firm owns his toxic debt. The moment they trigger an audit, he is going to be indicted for corporate fraud. You do not need my signature to manage the trusts. You need my signature so you can secretly mortgage this lodge and inject cash into his failing company before the feds show up." The air in the library went completely dead. My father's jaw ticked visibly, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. He knew the jig was up, but he was far too arrogant to admit defeat. "You are going to pick up that pen, Nia," my father said, taking a slow, menacing step closer to me. "You are going to sign the waiver. And then you are going to pack your bags, take your son, and walk out of this house. If you breathe a single word of this to Estelle or to anyone else, I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. I will bury you in litigation until you cannot afford to feed that child." I looked at the pen resting on top of the documents. I looked at my brother, who was shaking like a leaf. I looked at my father, whose entire legacy was built on bullying people into submission. And then I smiled. No, I said. My voice was absolute iron. The movement was so fast I barely registered it. Vivian lunged forward, her arms swinging in a wide, brutal arc. The palm of her hand struck my left cheek with a sickening crack. The force of the slap snapped my head to the side, sending a shockwave of stinging heat radiating across my jaw. The heavy diamond rings on her fingers scratched the delicate skin near my cheekbone. "Are you going to watch your brother go to prison?" My mother screamed. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly desperation. "You selfish brat. Sign it right now." The silence that followed the slap was absolute. MJ took a step back, terrified of the violence. My father breathed heavily, waiting for me to break. They expected the old Nia. They expected the girl who used to cry when she was yelled at, the daughter who craved their approval so desperately she would do anything to keep the peace. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. I raised my hand and gently touched the burning red mark blooming across my cheek. I felt the slight sting of a small scratch from her rings. I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were completely dry and my heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic calm. I reached into my clutch purse. My mother watched me, expecting me to pull out a tissue to wipe my eyes or perhaps reach for the heavy brass pen on the desk. Instead, I pulled out my cell phone. "What are you doing?" my father demanded, his voice suddenly lacing with a new, unfamiliar thread of panic. "Put that away." I did not answer him. I kept my eyes locked dead onto my mother's terrified face as I unlocked the screen. I tapped the phone app and began to dial. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked loudly from the hallway side before my thumb could press the green call button. My father spun around in shock as the heavy oak doors swung inward. Chloe stood in the threshold. The panicked, sobbing wife from the great room was entirely gone. In her place was the cold, calculating heiress she had been trained to be since birth. Her posture was rigid, her chin tilted upward in absolute arrogance. Flanking her was a tall, silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable aura of old money defense counsel, a man paid exorbitant sums to make wealthy people's problems quietly disappear. "What is going on here, Richard?" my mother asked, taking a step back. MJ rushed to his wife's side. "Chloe, what are you doing? I told you to stay upstairs." Chloe ignored her husband completely. She walked into the soundproof library, the silver-haired man following closely behind her. The man did not ask for permission. He walked straight to my father's desk, pushed MJ's fraudulent inheritance waiver to the side, and unclasped his briefcase. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth, patronizing, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I am Arthur Vance, lead counsel for Chloe's family estate. My client has informed me of the unfortunate situation regarding MJ's business liabilities and your current attempt to secure capital through this property." My father puffed out his chest, trying to regain control of his own library. "This is a private family matter, Arthur. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here." Arthur offered a thin, bloodless smile. "I have jurisdiction wherever my client's family assets are at risk, Richard. And right now, my primary concern is ensuring Chloe is fully insulated from the catastrophic fallout of her husband's criminal embezzlement. We are fully aware of the missing funds. And we are fully aware that your daughter Nia is currently the only obstacle preventing the immediate liquidation of this lodge to cover those debts." He turned his cold gray eyes onto me. He looked me up and down, taking in my simple wool cardigan and the red mark still blooming on my cheek from my mother's hand. He dismissed me instantly as a threat. To him, I was nothing but a minor bureaucratic hurdle. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the desk with a heavy thud. "This is a non-disclosure agreement and a transfer of deed consent form," Arthur stated, tapping the thick pile of paper. "You are going to sign both of these, Nia. If you refuse, my firm will immediately file a massive defamation lawsuit against you in civil court. We will claim you attempted to extort your brother and maliciously manufactured evidence of embezzlement to ruin his reputation." I stared at the lawyer, completely unfazed by the threat of litigation. "A civil suit will trigger discovery." "Arthur," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, The moment your firm subpoenas the financial records, the federal auditors will see the phantom revenue streams MJ created. You would be handing his prison sentence directly to the authorities. You are bluffing. Arthur did not blink. His smile merely widened, revealing perfectly capped white teeth. He leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the mahogany desk, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. Perhaps he whispered smoothly. But a defamation suit is merely a distraction. The real consequence of your refusal will be much more personal. Chloe stepped up beside her lawyer, crossing her arms over her chest. The stolen diamonds sparkled mockingly in the library light. Go ahead, Arthur. Tell her what my father authorized. If you do not sign these papers immediately, Arthur said, dropping his voice to a lethal calm register, we will file an emergency petition with Child Protective Services first thing Monday morning. The air in the room vanished. The blood in my veins stopped moving. Arthur picked up a single sheet of paper from his stack and read from it, as if reading a grocery list. We will submit a comprehensive report detailing your highly unstable mental state, your volatile living conditions, and your complete inability to financially provide for a child. We have statements prepared from your own parents, Richard and Vivian, testifying to your erratic behavior and your history of unprovoked aggression. We will paint you as an impoverished, deeply disturbed single mother, who is entirely unfit to raise a 5-year-old boy. My mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand, but she did not say a single word to defend me. My father looked away, staring at the floorboards. They had agreed to this. They had agreed to let Chloe's family use my son to break me. The state will take Leo away from you, Nia. Arthur continued, his voice dripping with venomous certainty. He will be placed in foster care while you spend the next 5 years bankrupting yourself in family court trying to win him back. You will lose your job, your home, and your child. All because you were too stubborn to sign a simple piece of paper. Chloe let out a soft, cruel laugh. She stepped closer to me, her eyes shining with malicious triumph. You really thought you could win this, Nia. You thought because you crunched numbers in a cubicle you could outsmart us. My family has senators on speed dial. We buy and sell people like you before breakfast. You cannot fight my family, Nia. You are absolutely nothing. They had crossed the line. They had crossed the only line that mattered. A cold, absolute stillness washed over me. The adrenaline, the fear, the lingering shock of my mother's slap, all of it, instantly evaporated. In its place was a terrifying clarity. They thought my son was my weakness. They thought threatening Leo would make me crumble to my knees and beg for mercy. They did not understand that threatening my child did not make me weak. It made me entirely lethal. I looked down at the cell phone I was still holding in my hand. I had opened the phone app earlier to call the authorities, but calling the police was no longer enough. The police would arrest MJ, but they would leave Chloe and her toxic, powerful family entirely untouched. I needed to destroy the entire foundation they stood on. I closed the phone app. I opened a secure encrypted messaging application I used exclusively for high-level corporate acquisitions. I pulled up a specific contact string labeled Vanguard Holdings. What are you doing? Chloe snapped, seeing my thumbs moving across the screen. I told you to put that phone away. Arthur, take it from her. Arthur reached out to grab my wrist, but I took a swift step back. My eyes locked onto the screen. I typed a single 4-word message. Execute the hostile takeover. I hit send. The small green checkmark appeared, confirming the message was delivered and read. I slowly lowered the phone. I looked at Arthur Vance standing in his expensive suit. I looked at my parents cowering in the shadows of their own library. And finally, I looked directly into Chloe's smug, triumphant eyes. You are right, Chloe, I said. My voice was no longer loud or angry. It was dangerously calm, a whisper that carried the weight of an absolute avalanche. I cannot fight your family. I paused, watching the momentary flash of victory cross her face before I delivered the final devastating blow. I just bought them. Arthur frowned, his professional composure slipping for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? I walked slowly toward the desk, picking up the heavy brass pen. But I did not reach for their documents. I used the pen to tap the mahogany wood, keeping a slow, steady rhythm. Marcus Vance told MJ that a shadow private equity group bought his toxic debt tonight. I said, my eyes never leaving Chloe. What Marcus did not know is that the shadow group is called Vanguard Holdings. And Vanguard Holdings is the private acquisition arm of the firm where I am a senior managing partner. MJ let out a choked, horrified gasp from the corner of the room. He gripped the edge of a bookshelf, his knuckles turning stark white. I did not just look at your financial reports this morning, MJ. I continued, turning my gaze to my brother. When I saw the embezzlement, I immediately contacted my board of directors. I showed them the underlying assets of your tech firm, the proprietary software, the patents, the user data. It is all highly valuable. It was just being managed by an absolute idiot. I convinced my firm to buy your debt for pennies on the dollar. I turned back to Chloe and Arthur. As of exactly 3 minutes ago, Vanguard Holdings initiated a hostile takeover. We just seized all of the company's assets. We froze every single corporate bank account. And because MJ used his company shares as collateral for the massive personal loans he took out from Chloe's family estate, those loans are now completely defaulted. Arthur's face drained of all color. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the leather armchair. The confident, expensive lawyer suddenly looked like a terrified old man. "What did you do?" Arthur whispered, his voice shaking. I triggered the cross-default clauses. I explained, my tone light and conversational. Chloe's father heavily leveraged his own real estate portfolio to back MJ's tech venture. Because MJ is now in default, the banks will immediately call in Chloe's family's loans. Her father's accounts are frozen. His properties will be seized by the end of the week. Your old money family, Chloe, is entirely bankrupt. Chloe let out a piercing, high-pitched scream. She lunged forward, her hands extended like claws, but MJ caught her around the waist, pulling her back. She thrashed against him, screaming that I was a liar, that it was impossible. But Arthur knew it was the truth. His phone began to vibrate violently in his breast pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the caller ID with wide, horrified eyes. It was Chloe's father. The financial collapse had already begun. I picked up the non-disclosure agreement and the CPS threat Arthur had placed on the desk. I ripped them neatly down the middle, letting the pieces flutter to the Persian rug. "You threatened my son," I said, stepping closer to Chloe until she stopped thrashing and stared at me in pure terror. "You thought you could use my child as leverage. Tomorrow morning, federal marshals are going to walk into your husband's office and arrest him for embezzlement. And when you try to run home to your daddy for help, you are going to find the gates to your estate padlocked by the bank." I turned to my parents, who were standing completely paralyzed against the bookshelves. My mother was trembling uncontrollably, tears ruining her perfect makeup. My father looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to ash. "And as for this lodge," I said, gesturing to the Grand Library, "Grandma Estelle signed a revised trust agreement 3 months ago. She transferred the deed directly into a blind trust for Leo. My father has absolutely no administrative power over this property. You cannot mortgage a house you do not own." I walked to the heavy oak doors and unlocked the brass deadbolt. I pulled the door open, letting the cold air from the hallway rush into the stifling room. "I am going upstairs to pack my son's bags," I said without looking back. "By the time the sun comes up, I want all of you out of my house." Before my hand could even close around the cold brass doorknob, MJ threw his entire body weight against the heavy oak wood. He scrambled frantically, blocking my exit, his designer shoes slipping on the Persian rug. He was weeping openly now, a pathetic broken shell of the arrogant tech visionary he had pretended to be just an hour ago. He babbled incoherently, begging me to stop the hostile takeover, pleading that Vanguard Holdings was just a mid-level equity firm that could not possibly finalize an asset seizure without a lengthy multi-quarter board review. He was desperately grasping at straws, praying for a corporate loophole that would give him enough time to run. I looked down at him, pity entirely absent from my heart. I did not say a word to him. I simply turned on my heel and walked right back to my father's massive mahogany desk. The original inheritance waiver, the fraudulent contract they had tried to force me to sign to steal my grandmother's legacy, was still sitting there. I picked it up, feeling the thick, expensive cardstock between my fingers. I crumpled it into a tight ball and tossed it casually into the brass wastebasket beside the desk. My mother let out a small, choked gasp, but she remained completely glued to the bookshelves, too terrified to move. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my iPad. I tapped the screen, waking it up. The bright backlight illuminated my face with a cool, glowing light, casting sharp shadows behind me. The atmosphere in the room physically shifted. The suffocating darkness of my family's lifelong psychological abuse seemed to burn away, replaced by a radiant, undeniable clarity. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and every single person in the room could feel it. "You think Vanguard Holdings is the top of the food chain, MJ?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silent library like a scalpel. "You think you are dealing with a standard collections agency that will negotiate terms? Vanguard is just a blank shell entity, a dummy corporation we use to quietly swallow toxic debt before the market catches on. My actual title is Senior Partner at the Obsidian Investment Fund." The name dropped into the room like a live grenade. Arthur Vance, the high-priced, silver-haired lawyer, let out a sharp, ragged breath and slumped heavily into the leather armchair. My father, Richard Sr., staggered back a step, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Everyone in the financial sector knew Obsidian. We were the absolute apex predators of the corporate world. We did not restructure failing businesses. We ruthlessly hunted down heavily indebted, fraudulent enterprises, liquidated their corrupt management teams, and sold the remaining assets for scrap. I was not a struggling, low-level bookkeeper, desperate for my family's charity. I was a titan in my own right, earning a ruthless 8-figure income by dismantling criminals exactly like my brother. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. The realization was slowly, agonizingly sinking into her brain. The daughter she had just publicly humiliated, the woman she had painted as a destitute single mother in front of Aspen's elite, was actually infinitely more powerful and wealthy than the golden boy she idolized. Vivian's entire reality was fracturing into a million irreparable pieces. I swiped my finger across the smooth glass of the iPad, opening the master forensic audit file I had finalized earlier that afternoon. It was a flawless, terrifyingly precise map of every single financial crime MJ had committed over the past 3 years. I did not just have rough estimates or quarterly projections. I had penetrated his firewalls. I had the exact figures tracked down to the very last cent. I walked slowly around the mahogany desk, closing the distance between us. MJ was still cowering by the door, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. Chloe stood frozen near the armchair, her hands clutching the stolen diamond necklace at her throat, as if trying to physically protect it from me. I stopped right in front of my brother. I held the iPad out, flipping the screen so the blinding white spreadsheet was mere inches from his terrified face. The bright red numbers highlighted his absolute destruction. $15 million, I stated the number, hanging in the air, heavy and absolute. MJ squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly side to side as if denying the visual evidence would somehow make it disappear. "Open your eyes and look at it," I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. He opened his eyes, staring at the spreadsheet. $15 million, I repeated. "That is the exact amount you embezzled from your innocent investors. You funneled $15 million through untraceable offshore shell companies just to pay for Chloe's custom diamond necklaces, her luxury sports cars, and a billionaire lifestyle you could never actually afford. You bled your own company dry to buy the illusion of success. And you honestly thought that forging Grandma Estelle's signature to illegally mortgage this mountain lodge would generate enough cash to save you from federal prison." My father let out a raw, guttural groan, clutching his chest as he realized the sheer scale of MJ's theft. $4 million from the lodge would never have covered the deficit. MJ had lied to them too. He had manipulated his own parents, minimizing the debt so they would help him commit real estate fraud against his own grandmother. "You lied to us, Richard," Senior roared, turning his fury onto his son. "You said you only needed $4 million to bridge the gap. You stole $15 million. "I had to," Dad, MJ sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "Chloe was going to leave me. Her father was going to cut me off. I just needed more time." Chloe backed away from her husband, an expression of pure revulsion crossing her perfectly contoured face. "You are bankrupt," she whispered, her voice dripping with disgust. "You are a fraud. You dragged my family's name into a federal embezzlement scheme. My father is going to absolutely destroy you, MJ." "Your father is currently dealing with his own bank freezing his assets, Chloe," I reminded her coldly. "Do not act like you are an innocent victim in this. My audit traces over $4 million directly to your personal accounts. You knew exactly where that money was coming from and you spent it anyway. When the feds arrive tomorrow morning, they will not just be handcuffing MJ. They will be taking you in as a willing co-conspirator." Chloe let out a sharp, terrified shriek and stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the Persian rug. She fell hard against the floorboards, but no one moved to help her up. Arthur Vance, her own expensive lawyer, simply looked away, already calculating how quickly he could recuse himself from this radioactive disaster. I looked at the people in the room. This was my family, a collection of greedy, arrogant manipulators who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They had demanded my submission. They had mocked my independence. They had threatened to use their power to rip my child away from me. And now they were completely broken, trapped in a soundproof room with the architect of their ultimate ruin. I tapped the screen of my iPad, closing the audit and locking the device. I slipped it casually back into my leather tote bag. The glow of the screen faded, leaving them in the dim, oppressive shadows of the library. "You wanted me to sign away my future," I said, my voice echoing in the absolute silence. "You wanted me to sacrifice myself to maintain this pathetic illusion of family loyalty. But you forgot one very important thing. I do not owe you anything. I owe my loyalty to my son and to myself." I stepped closer to MJ, looking down at him as he wept against the oak doors. "Move," I ordered. He scrambled out of the way, pulling his knees to his chest. I reached out and grabbed the brass doorknob, turning it slowly. The heavy door clicked open. I paused in the threshold, looking back at my mother. She was staring at me, a look of profound horror and desperate realization etched deeply into her features. She finally saw the monster she had protected and the powerhouse she had thrown away. "Remember what I said?" I told them, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "By the time the sun comes up, I want all of you out of my house. And if any of you ever attempt to contact me or my son again, I will make sure the Obsidian liquidators leave you with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs." I walked out into the hallway, leaving the library door wide open behind me. The silence of the lodge was finally real. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of hidden secrets and unspoken resentment. It was the clear, beautiful silence of absolute victory. I walked up the grand staircase to pack Leo's bags, ready to leave the mountain and step into a life that belonged entirely to me. My foot had barely touched the third step of the grand staircase when a harsh, grating voice echoed through the foyer. "Not so fast, Nia." I stopped. I turned around slowly, my hand resting on the polished oak banister. Arthur Vance stepped out of the library, his leather briefcase gripped tightly in his hands. He was desperately trying to salvage his fractured professional pride. Following close behind him was my brother. The grand chandelier above the foyer illuminated the heavy bead of sweat rolling down MJ's pale forehead. MJ was breathing in shallow, jagged gasps, but a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope had suddenly reignited in his eyes. Arthur marched to the center of the foyer, planting his expensive shoes on the marble floor. He adjusted his silk tie, attempting to project the absolute authority he had completely lost just moments ago. "You put on a very impressive theatrical display in there," Arthur said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And while your corporate maneuver regarding your brother's tech firm might be legally binding, you are overlooking one massive foundational detail." Chloe stepped out of the library, next flanked by my mother and father. Chloe's posture had straightened again. She crossed her arms, her manicured fingers tapping against her elbows. She looked at her lawyer, expecting him to deliver the killing blow that would put me back in my place. "You see?" Nia, Arthur continued, a smug smile twisting his lips. "The hostile takeover of the tech company does not magically negate the transaction regarding this real estate property." MJ initiated the mortgage application for this mountain lodge 3 days ago, using the administrative powers granted by your parents. The bank already processed the paperwork. The deed transfer was expedited through local municipal channels yesterday afternoon. My father looked up, a sudden wave of relief washing over his tired face. Vivian let out a long, trembling breath, leaning against the doorframe. They actually believed they were saved. Because MJ's credit profile was highly leveraged, Arthur explained. Tapping his briefcase, the underwriting bank immediately bundled that high-risk mortgage debt and sold it off to a secondary private holding company to clear their own ledgers. The transaction is completely finalized. The capital has already been released to a holding account. Arthur let out a short, barking laugh that echoed loudly in the high-ceilinged space. So what? You took over a failing tech firm. Congratulations. But the mortgage on this lodge is completely valid, and its ownership is currently sitting in the hands of an anonymous private company. You cannot stop the foreclosure. You cannot reverse the collateral damage. What can you actually stop? Chloe smiled, a cold, vicious smirk that twisted her beautiful features into something incredibly ugly. You lose, Nia, she spat. You thought you were so clever, but you still lose. I stood on the staircase looking down at the group of people who shared my blood and the parasites who fed off them. The warm golden light from the crystal chandelier bathed the space around me, glowing with a vibrant, radiant energy. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt nothing but supreme, absolute confidence. I slowly descended the stairs, my footsteps silent against the plush carpet runner. I reached the marble floor of the foyer and walked directly toward them. I did not stop until I was standing mere inches away from MJ and Chloe. The smirk on Chloe's face began to waver as she registered the utter lack of defeat in my eyes. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out my iPad for the second time tonight. I woke the screen, bringing up a highly classified internal banking ledger. Your lawyer is quite inefficient, Chloe. I said, my voice soft, but carrying a lethal razor-sharp edge. He relies on outdated public filings and assumes he is the smartest person in the room. He is completely out of his depth. I held the iPad up so Arthur could see the glowing screen. His gray eyes darted across the digital document. The smug arrogance drained from his face, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. It is true that the bank processed the fraudulent mortgage on this lodge, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on Chloe. It is true that they immediately bundled that specific debt portfolio and sold it off early yesterday morning to a private holding firm. But your lawyer failed to check the actual corporate registry of the purchasing entity. I took a slow, deliberate step toward MJ, forcing him to stumble backward against the heavy wooden console table in the hallway. The bank sold that entire debt portfolio yesterday morning to the Obsidian Fund. I stated every single syllable falling like an anvil. And I am the managing director of Obsidian. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the lungs of every single person standing in the foyer. Arthur Vance dropped his briefcase. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, popping open, and spilling his useless legal documents across the stone. He did not even bother to pick them up. He just stared at me, his jaw slack, his entire professional reality crumbling into dust. I turned my attention entirely to my brother. MJ was shaking violently. The sweat that had been rolling down his forehead was now pouring down his face, soaking the collar of his expensive designer shirt. His eyes were wide, filled with the terrifying realization that he had walked blindly into a trap from which there was absolutely no escape. I raised my hand and tapped my index finger firmly against the center of MJ's chest. The physical contact made him flinch as if he had been burned. I do not need to sign the waiver for this house, MJ, I told him, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Because I already own it. I bought the fraudulent debt you created. I own the mortgage. I own your garbage tech company. I hold the defaulted loans tied directly to your father-in-law's estate. In short, I am the creditor to all of you. MJ let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, sliding down the edge of the console table until he collapsed onto his knees on the marble floor. He buried his face in his hands, weeping with loud, humiliating sobs. The golden boy, the brilliant entrepreneur, the favorite son, was nothing but a broken criminal kneeling at my feet. Chloe stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The realization that her entire life of luxury, her status, her generational wealth, was now entirely under my control, had short-circuited her brain. She looked at Arthur for help, but the lawyer was already backing away toward the front door, desperately trying to distance himself from the toxic implosion of his clients. My parents stood in the doorway of the library, completely paralyzed. They had spent decades treating me like an afterthought. They had dismissed my intelligence, mocked my career path, and relentlessly praised the son who had ultimately destroyed their lives. Now they were staring at the daughter who held the keys to their survival. "Nia," my father whispered, his voice cracking. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling. "Nia, please, you cannot do this. This is our home. This is your family." I turned to look at Richard Sr. The man who had gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise just an hour ago was now looking at me with the fearful, pleading eyes of a beggar. "You made it perfectly clear that I am not part of this family, Richard," I replied, using his first name to sever whatever remaining illusion of a paternal bond he thought we shared. "You stood in that library and authorized a plan to take my 5-year-old son away from me. You agreed to let them paint me as an unfit mother so you could protect a thief. You lost the right to invoke the word family the moment you allowed them to threaten my child." My mother let out a loud, tragic wail, covering her face as the consequences of her actions finally crashed down upon her. Vivian had spent her entire life curating a perfect image, hiding behind expensive clothes and country club memberships. Now she was going to be the mother of a convicted felon, a woman who had aided and abetted fraud against her own daughter and her own mother-in-law. Her social standing was eradicated. "You have exactly until sunrise," I repeated, looking at the pathetic group gathered in the foyer. "At 6 o'clock in the morning, my asset management team will arrive with federal authorities to secure this property. Anyone still inside this lodge will be removed for trespassing." I did not wait for their responses. I did not care about their tears, their apologies, or their desperate bargains. I turned away from them, leaving MJ sobbing on the floor and my parents clinging to the doorframe of their stolen library. I walked back up the grand staircase, my posture perfectly straight, my heart beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway to the guest room where my son was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the absolute destruction and rebirth that had just occurred downstairs. I opened the door and stepped into the quiet room, illuminated only by the soft glow of a small bedside lamp. Leo was curled under a thick down comforter, his small chest rising and falling in deep, restful sleep. A profound sense of peace washed over me, replacing the decades of anxiety and inadequate feelings I had harbored in this house. I pulled my suitcase from the closet and began to pack. I folded my clothes carefully, placing them neatly inside the bag. I gathered Leo's favorite toys, his storybooks, and his warm sweaters. I packed with precision and care, knowing that every item I placed into the suitcase was a step closer to absolute freedom. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was no longer the scapegoat for my family's dysfunction. I was a powerhouse. I was a mother who had burned an empire to the ground to protect her child. When the suitcase was zipped and ready by the door, I walked over to the bed and gently brushed a soft curl from Leo's forehead. He stirred slightly, letting out a quiet, sleepy sigh before settling back into his dreams. "We are going home, little man," I whispered softly into the quiet room. "We are finally going home." And as I looked out the frost-covered window at the dark, towering pines of the Aspen Mountains waiting for the morning light to break, I knew that no one would ever dare to threaten us again. I turned away from the frost-covered window, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool room air. The lodge was entirely silent, but it was a heavy, waiting silence. I zipped my overnight bag, grabbed my thick wool winter coat, and walked over to the bed. I carefully slid my arms under Leo, lifting him gently against my chest. He was a solid, warm weight, his breath puffing rhythmically against my neck as he slept peacefully through the storm. I grabbed the handle of my rolling suitcase and stepped out of the guest bedroom. As I reached the top landing of the grand staircase, I looked down at the foyer below. It was a picture of absolute devastation. The sweeping wide angle of the grand entrance hall framed them perfectly, as if they were statues turned to stone by the sheer magnitude of their own hubris. No one had moved a single inch since I had walked out of the library. MJ was still slumped against the heavy wooden console table, his eyes vacant and staring at nothing. My father sat heavily on the bottom step of the staircase, his head buried in his hands, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the corporate dictator he used to be. Chloe paced erratically near the front doors, her breathing jagged and shallow, her hands tearing at her own hair. Arthur Vance stood rigidly near the coat check, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away a massive migraine. The sharp click of my suitcase wheels rolling over the top step snapped them out of their paralyzed trance. Every single head whipped around to look at me as I began my descent. My mother Vivian was the first to move. The cold, calculating matriarch who had slapped me across the face with her diamond rings less than an hour ago suddenly underwent a miraculous 180-degree transformation. Her face contorted, dropping the mask of elitist disgust and replacing it with a look of desperate fawning affection. She practically scrambled across the marble floor, her expensive silk gown swishing around her ankles, rushing toward the bottom of the stairs to intercept me as I reached the final step. "Nia," she cried out, her voice thick with manufactured emotion, pitching upward into a hysterical plea. "Nia, my darling daughter." She reached out with both hands and grabbed my free arm, clutching my fingers with a frantic, clinging grip. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. "I always knew you were the best," Vivian sobbed, forcing her eyes to well up with tears. "I always told your father how brilliant you are, how smart and capable you always were. We are family, Nia. You are my flesh and blood. You will forgive your brother and tear up that terrible debt, right? We can fix this together as a family. Just the four of us. We can make this all go away." I stopped on the bottom step, standing slightly above her. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her pivot was almost breathtaking. She honestly believed she could slap me, threaten to take my child, and then smooth it all over with a few fake tears and the word family. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic hysterics. I simply pulled my hand out of her grip with a sharp, deliberate motion. I shifted Leo slightly in my arms, making sure he was secure. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a clean white linen handkerchief. Keeping my eyes deadlocked on my mother's terrified face, I slowly and methodically wiped the back of my hand. I wiped exactly where her fingers had just touched my skin, treating her physical contact like a contagious disease. Vivian watched me, her breath hitching in her throat. When I was finished, I let the handkerchief slip from my fingers, dropping it onto the marble floor at her feet. "Family?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "Are you really going to use that word, Vivian?" She flinched as I used her first name, stepping back as if I had struck her physically. "Family are the people who stood in that library and actively plotted to strip away my custody of my own son." I stated, my words falling like heavy stones. "Family are the people who threatened to ruin me in civil court with fabricated evidence. Family are the people who ordered a single mother and a 5-year-old child to pack their bags and walk out into negative 10-degree snow while completely broke. You did not care if we froze. You did not care if we starved. You only cared about protecting a thief." Vivian's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. The fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by genuine primal fear. "You do not have a daughter anymore," I said with absolute finality, locking my gaze with hers. "You have a creditor, and I will collect every single penny you owe me." Across the foyer, the sound of my words seemed to snap whatever thin thread of sanity Chloe was clinging to. The reality of her family's impending financial annihilation finally broke through her shock. She spun around, her eyes wide and wild, and charged directly at her lawyer. "Do something!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing violently in the grand space. She grabbed Arthur Vance by the lapels of his expensive charcoal suit, shaking him with a sudden burst of frantic strength. "You are my family's lead counsel. You are paid to fix this. Find a loophole. File an injunction. You have to protect my assets. My father is going to lose everything. Do your job and destroy her." Arthur Vance did not flinch. He did not offer her a comforting word or a patronizing smile. He simply reached up and firmly removed Chloe's manicured hands from his suit jacket. He smoothed his lapels with clinical precision, his expression entirely devoid of the arrogance he had displayed in the library. He looked at Chloe not as a valuable high-net-worth client, but as a sinking ship he was desperate to evacuate. He turned, picked up his leather briefcase from the floor where he had dropped it earlier, and clicked the brass latches shut. The sharp metallic sound cut through Chloe's hysterical panting. "I am sorry, Chloe," Arthur said, his voice completely flat and professional. Chloe froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What do you mean you are sorry? Fix it." "There is absolutely nothing I can do," Arthur stated, adjusting his grip on the heavy briefcase. "Under federal law, your husband has committed massive corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. He used illegally obtained funds to finance your lifestyle and leverage further debt. The federal government and the Obsidian Fund will seize every single asset tied to those accounts, including your father's heavily leveraged estate. It is a mathematical certainty." Chloe staggered backward, shaking her head in violent denial. "No, no, you work for us. We pay you millions. You have to save us." "Your family cannot save this case," Arthur replied bluntly, his gray eyes entirely cold. "And my firm will not tether itself to a sinking criminal enterprise. Consider my representation officially terminated." Without another word, Arthur Vance turned his back on the weeping heiress. He walked to the heavy oak front doors, opened them to let a blast of freezing mountain wind sweep into the foyer, and stepped out into the dark night, closing the door firmly behind him. The freezing mountain wind howled through the open doorway, biting into the grand foyer, and scattering the torn remnants of Arthur Vance's non-disclosure agreement across the polished marble floor. My father took a hesitant step forward, intending to push the heavy oak doors shut and block out the bitter cold, but he froze. Blinding beams of light suddenly cut through the heavy curtain of falling snow, illuminating the darkness outside. The low, aggressive rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the floorboards. 3 large black SUVs pulled into the circular driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the packed ice. They parked at sharp, coordinated angles, entirely blocking the exit and sealing off the property. The synchronized slam of heavy car doors echoed like a barrage of gunfire in the frigid night air. Red and blue emergency lights ignited, painting the snow-covered pine trees and the grand columns of the lodge in violent flashing colors. My mother let out a strangled gasp, backing away from the open doorway and pressing her spine against the wall. MJ stopped his pathetic weeping. He lifted his head from his knees, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute terror as the flashing lights reflected across his pale, sweating face. Chloe remained completely catatonic on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth as her reality disintegrated around her. Through the blinding glare of the headlights, a figure emerged from the blizzard. The rhythmic, sharp tapping of a wooden cane against the stone steps announced her arrival before she even crossed the threshold. The silver tip of the cane struck the marble floor of the foyer with a definitive, commanding thud. It was my grandmother, Estelle. She did not look like the frail, easily manipulated elderly woman MJ had banked his entire criminal enterprise on. She stood tall, her spine straight, her silver hair perfectly coiffed beneath a thick sable coat. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, were currently hardened into twin chips of glacial ice. She radiated an aura of terrifying absolute authority. Flanking her on either side, stepping into the foyer with synchronized military precision, were 3 tall, broad-shouldered men in dark, tailored suits. The flashing emergency lights outside illuminated the bright gold and blue FBI badges securely clipped to their belts. MJ let out a desperate, ragged breath. He pushed himself off the floor, slipping slightly on the slick marble, and scrambled toward the elderly matriarch. Grandma MJ choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Grandma, thank God you are here. Nia is out of her mind. She is trying to steal everything. You have to stop her. You have to tell them I was just trying to protect the family estate." Estelle did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer him a warm embrace or a sympathetic ear. She simply raised her silver-tipped cane and planted it firmly against MJ's chest, physically stopping his forward momentum and forcing him to step back. "Do not you dare call me that, you arrogant, foolish boy," Estelle said, her voice slicing through the foyer with lethal precision. Her tone was completely devoid of any familial warmth. It was the voice of a ruthless corporate founder addressing a thief. MJ blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing in shock. "But Grandma, I only wanted to secure the lodge. I was managing the assets exactly like you taught me." "You truly believe I am that blind?" Estelle sneered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward and forcing MJ to cower beneath her intense glare. "You think this old woman is so senile, so mentally compromised, that I would not recognize a blatant amateur forgery of my own signature on a massive commercial mortgage application? You thought you could use my legacy, the estate I built with my own two hands, to bail out your pathetic, fraudulent lifestyle." My father stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Mother, please. There has been a massive misunderstanding. MJ just made a slight error in judgment. We can handle this privately. We can fix the books." Estelle turned her piercing gaze onto her son, silencing him instantly. "There is no fixing this, Richard. Your son is a criminal, and you and Vivian are entirely complicit in your blind, pathetic worship of him. You let him bleed his investors dry, and then you stood in my house and authorized a plan to destroy Nia to cover his tracks." Estelle turned her head slowly, locking eyes with me across the foyer. A silent look of profound respect and deep, unwavering trust passed between us. "I did not just find out about this forgery today," Estelle continued, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "I knew MJ was sinking 6 months ago. The numbers did not add up. The sudden influx of cash, the ridiculous luxury purchases, the frantic leveraging of Chloe's family assets. I saw the rot spreading, but I needed proof. Ironclad, undeniable proof." She pointed her cane directly at MJ's chest. "So I secretly went to the only person in this family with the intelligence, the integrity, and the lethal capability to tear your fraudulent empire down to its foundations. I asked Nia to launch a shadow audit of your corporate ledgers 6 months ago." MJ gasped, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization. The trap had not just been sprung tonight. He had been walking blindly inside it for half a year, carefully monitored and tracked by the sister he thought was completely beneath his notice. My mother Vivian let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing onto the bottom step of the staircase. Her perfect world was gone. The illusion of her superior golden child was shattered, completely dismantled by the mother-in-law she secretly despised and the daughter she had openly abused. The lead FBI agent, a tall man with a chiseled jaw and cold, assessing eyes, stepped entirely out of Estelle's shadow. He walked directly toward MJ, his hand resting casually on the utility belt at his waist. "Michael James Vance," the agent said, his voice a flat, booming baritone that echoed off the high ceilings. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. We hold a federal warrant for your immediate arrest." MJ shook his head violently, raising his hands in a futile gesture of surrender. No, wait. You do not understand. I have the capital. The holding company just bought the debt. I can make everyone whole." Agent Miller ignored the frantic pleading. He reached out and grabbed MJ by the shoulder, spinning him around with brutal, practiced efficiency. He kicked MJ's legs apart, forcing him into a vulnerable stance against the hallway wall. "You are being placed under federal arrest for 3 counts of felony wire fraud, 2 counts of corporate embezzlement, and 1 count of forging federal legal documents," Agent Miller stated, reciting the Miranda rights with a mechanical, chilling calmness. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp, metallic, ratcheting click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around MJ's wrists echoed loudly in the foyer. It was the sound of absolute finality, the sound of an empire collapsing into dust. No, Vivian screamed, her voice tearing through the room with a raw, ugly desperation. My mother scrambled off the stairs, her silk gown tearing as her heel caught the edge of the marble step. She lunged blindly toward the federal agents, completely abandoning her curated country club elegance. She threw herself at Agent Miller, desperately grabbing the heavy wool sleeve of his tactical jacket, trying to physically pry his hands off her weeping son. "You cannot take him!" Vivian shrieked, her face red, and distorted, her perfect hair falling in a tangled mess around her shoulders. "He is a good boy. He is the CEO. It is a mistake. Let him go right now. Do you know who we are? We know the governor. We will have your badge for this." Agent Miller did not even blink. He simply locked his jaw and effortlessly shoved Vivian backward. The force of the push sent my mother stumbling across the slick marble. "Ma'am, step back immediately," the second FBI agent warned, stepping between Vivian and the arresting officer. He pointed a stern warning finger directly at my mother's face. "If you attempt to lay your hands on a federal agent again or interfere with this arrest in any capacity, I will personally put you in handcuffs and charge you with obstruction of justice. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Richard Sr. rushed forward, grabbing his hysterical wife by the shoulders and pulling her back against the wall. He was breathing heavily, his face pale and drawn. He wrapped his arms around Vivian, holding her back as she sobbed uncontrollably into his chest. He knew it was over. He knew their money, their connections, and their aggressive bullying tactics were completely useless against the crushing weight of federal indictments and the infinite resources of the Obsidian Fund. Chloe remained on the floor, watching her husband being dragged toward the front doors. She did not move to help him. She did not cry out his name. She simply stared at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, knowing that he had just dragged her entire family down into the abyss with him. I stood on the bottom step of the staircase, holding Leo securely against my chest. My son was still sleeping, the heavy wool of my coat shielding him from the freezing wind blowing through the open doors. I watched the scene unfold with a slow, steady heartbeat. The absolute chaos, the screaming, the tears, the flashing red and blue lights, it all washed over me without leaving a single mark. Estelle walked over to me, the silver tip of her cane clicking softly against the marble. She stopped in front of me, looking at the sleeping boy in my arms, and then looking up into my eyes. The fierce, icy glare she had used on MJ melted away entirely, replaced by a warm, profound pride. "You did perfectly, my girl," Estelle said, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper meant only for me. "You protected your son. You protected our legacy. It is time for you to go home now. I will handle the garbage disposal here." I smiled, a genuine soft smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "Thank you, Grandma." I adjusted my grip on my suitcase, stepping off the bottom stair and walking directly across the foyer. I did not look at my mother as she wept against the wall. I did not look at my father, who was staring at the floor in absolute defeat. I did not look at Chloe shivering on the Persian rug. They were no longer my family. They were just ghosts inhabiting a world I was leaving behind forever. I walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping into the freezing mountain blizzard. The cold air hit my face, feeling crisp and incredibly clean. A black town car was idling at the edge of the driveway, waiting specifically for me. The driver stepped out instantly, opening the rear door and taking my suitcase. I slid into the warm leather interior of the car, holding my son close. As the driver closed the door, shutting out the flashing emergency lights and the howling wind, I looked down at Leo. He was safe, he was secure, and we were finally entirely free. The heavy tires of the town car crunched against the packed ice as the driver shifted into gear. I settled back into the leather seat, holding Leo close, ready to leave the mountain forever. But before the car could pull away from the circular driveway, a piercing shriek shattered the rhythm of the howling blizzard. I tapped the partition glass, signaling the driver to stop. I rolled down my tinted window, letting the biting wind swirl into the cabin. From my position in the back seat, looking over my shoulder through the open window, I had a perfect view of the front steps. Chloe had burst through the heavy oak doors, stumbling blindly into the freezing storm. She had completely abandoned the poise and arrogance she wore like a second skin. Her designer gown was soaked in snow, and she was frantically jabbing at the screen of her gold-plated smartphone. Her hands were shaking so violently, she almost dropped it twice before finally hitting the speakerphone button and holding it up like a lifeline. The flashing red and blue lights of the FBI vehicles painted her pale face in harsh, alternating colors. Two agents were already dragging MJ down the steps in handcuffs, pushing him past his hysterical wife. He called out to her, but she did not even look at him. Her entire survival depended on the phone in her hand. "Dad!" she screamed into the phone, her voice ragged and hysterical over the roaring wind. "Dad, pick up. You have to help us. They are taking MJ. The feds are arresting him right now. You have to call your lawyers. You have to call the governor. Save us." For a long, agonizing moment, there was only the sound of the blizzard and the heavy breathing of my sister-in-law. Then the line connected. The voice that echoed through the speaker was not filled with paternal concern. It was a voice carved from pure, ruthless ice. It was the voice of a billionaire patriarch who protected his own wealth above absolutely everything else. "I am already aware of the situation, Chloe," her father said, his tone clinically detached. "The FBI raided his secondary holding offices 20 minutes ago." "Then do something," Chloe pleaded, dropping to her knees on the frozen stone. "Send the legal team, post his bail. You have the money. You know all the judges." "You are not listening to me, Chloe," her father replied, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "Your husband is being indicted for federal wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. He stole from his own investors. He forged financial documents. He is radioactive." "But I am your daughter," she sobbed, clinging to the phone. "We need your help." "And you are going to listen to me very carefully," he commanded, cutting her off completely. "Our family has spent 4 generations building a pristine corporate reputation. We do not associate with common thieves. We do not attach our legacy to garbage. You will not post his bail. You will not visit him in federal holding. You will cut all contact with that family immediately." Chloe stared at the phone, her jaw trembling. "But Dad, I am his wife." "Not anymore," her father stated with absolute finality. "My legal team is already drafting your divorce papers as we speak. They will be waiting for you at my city office by the time you drive down the mountain. You will sign them immediately. You will drop his last name. You will return to our estate tonight, and you will never speak of Michael James Vance again. Do you understand me?" "Dad, please do not do this to me," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I have nowhere else to go. Sign the papers, Chloe, or I will cut you off completely." The line went dead with a sharp, definitive click. The dial tone echoed weakly through the speaker before fading into the sound of the howling wind. Chloe remained frozen on her knees, her perfectly manicured fingers slowly losing their grip on the gold-plated phone. It slipped from her hands, hitting the icy stone steps with a dull thud. The screen cracked, fracturing into a dozen jagged pieces. The white privilege, the generational wealth, the untouchable status she had lorded over me for years had evaporated in an instant. She had thought her family name made her invincible. She thought she could mock me, belittle me, and hide behind her father's fortune. But in the ruthless world of high finance, she was just an asset to be protected, and MJ had just become a liability that needed to be liquidated immediately. She had lost everything. Her husband was being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. Her stolen wealth was being seized by the government. And her own family had just discarded her like trash to protect their precious reputation. She was left with absolutely nothing, kneeling in the freezing snow, wearing a borrowed name that now meant nothing but disgrace and ruin. And I looked at her one last time over my shoulder. A broken, empty shell of a woman who had tried to destroy me and my son. There was no pity in my heart. There was only the cold, hard reality of consequence. I pressed the button to roll up the window, shutting out the noise of her sobbing and the wailing of the wind. The thick glass sealed the cabin, plunging us back into warm, quiet safety. "Drive," I told the man behind the wheel, my voice steady and calm. The town car pulled away from the lodge, gliding smoothly down the mountain road, leaving the flashing lights and the shattered remains of my former family far behind in the dark. The drive back to civilization was the most peaceful journey of my life. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the storm had cleared and I was standing in the grand foyer of my parents' primary estate in Atlanta. Grandma Estelle had flown in on her private jet, arriving just moments before I did. The sprawling mansion, which had always felt like a museum dedicated to my parents' vanity, was now entirely under my control. My parents, Richard Sr. and Vivian, had been escorted back to the estate by federal authorities after a grueling night of interrogations regarding MJ's massive embezzlement scheme. They looked like entirely different people. Their expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and their faces were gaunt and pale. The reality of their total financial and social ruin had finally crushed the last remaining fragments of their arrogant pride. The morning light streamed through the towering, arched windows, catching the subtle, deeply satisfied smile that rested on my face. I stood beside my grandmother, watching the two people who had made my life a living hell finally face the absolute destruction of their own making. I let my eyes wander over the massive oil portraits hanging on the walls depicting my parents and my brother in perfect regal poses. I was entirely absent from those walls, just as I had been absent from their hearts. But today, those portraits belonged to me. My father suddenly lurched forward. His knees hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, pathetic thud. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me, and then at his mother. The man who had spent his entire life demanding submission from everyone around him was now weeping openly, groveling at the feet of the daughter he had thrown away. "You cannot do this to us, Nia," he begged, his voice trembling with genuine terror. "We will lose our positions at the country club. Our friends will completely abandon us. We will lose absolutely every ounce of respect we have in this city. We will be laughingstocks. Please, Nia, you have to leave us something to maintain our face. You cannot take the house." Vivian dropped to her knees beside him, clutching the edge of Grandma Estelle's sable coat. Her eyes were bloodshot, her makeup completely ruined, smearing dark tracks down her cheeks. "Please, Estelle," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "We did not know the extent of what MJ was doing. You have to believe us. We are your family. You cannot leave us destitute like this. We will do whatever you want." Grandma Estelle did not flinch. She looked down at her son and daughter-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She raised her silver-tipped cane and brought it down hard against the floor. The sharp crack echoed through the massive foyer, instantly silencing my parents' pathetic whimpering. "You dare invoke the word family to me?" Estelle demanded, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You two fools took the money I entrusted to this family and used it to blindly enable a criminal. You watched MJ bleed his investors dry, and you covered for him because you cared more about his fake billionaire lifestyle than you cared about the truth. Worse than that, you actively trampled on a brilliant, talented granddaughter who actually possessed the integrity to save this family. You threw Naya and my great-grandson out into the freezing snow to protect a thief. You disgust me." My father squeezed his eyes shut, bowing his head toward the floor. Vivian let out a choked gasp, burying her face in her hands, shaking with uncontrollable sobs. As of this exact moment, Estelle continued her tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Your entire trust fund is permanently cut off. Every single account, every line of credit, and every corporate perk you have enjoyed for decades has been frozen and revoked. You are cut out of the will completely. Furthermore, this Atlanta mansion is no longer your property. It has been officially seized by Nia to cover the massive debts you and your golden son accrued." The words landed like a physical blow. Richard Sr. let out a hollow, broken sound, wrapping his arms around his stomach as if he had been gutted. Vivian simply stared at the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their downfall. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the high society galas were all gone forever. They were bankrupt and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. They had traded their humanity for status, and now they possessed neither. I stepped forward, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked down at the two people who had spent 30 years trying to make me feel small and insignificant. There was no anger left in me. There was no sadness and no desire for their elusive approval. There was only a cold, precise clarity. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and get out of my house. I told them, my voice steady and absolute. Do not try to take any artwork, furniture, or jewelry that was purchased with company funds. My asset liquidators will be inventorying every single item in this estate by noon tomorrow. If anything is missing, I will have you arrested for theft, or... Vivian looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. But Nia, where are we supposed to go? We do not have any cash. How are we supposed to move our things? You cannot just throw us out onto the street. I offered her a tight, completely humorless smile, mirroring the exact expression she used to give me when denying me help. Do not worry, Mother, I replied. I will call the absolute cheapest moving truck in the city to come pick up your boxes. I know how much you both value saving money now. I turned my back on them, leaving them kneeling on the floor of the foyer. The sound of their weeping echoed behind me, bouncing off the marble walls. But it was just white noise now. I walked out the front doors with my grandmother, stepping into the bright, warm sunlight of a brand new day. The heavy oak doors closed firmly behind us, sealing my parents inside the tomb of their own making. The empire of lies they had built was finally ashes, and I was ready to build my own. The ambient heat from the lodge's massive stone fireplace wrapped around my shoulders like a thick protective blanket. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, my boots planted firmly on the polished marble floor. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, I stepped toward the towering frost-covered windows and wiped away a thin layer of condensation with the sleeve of my sweater. The view outside was a brutal masterpiece of absolute poetic justice. The violent flashing of red and blue emergency lights sliced through the heavy curtain of falling snow, illuminating the total destruction of the Vance family empire. Two broad-shouldered federal agents flanked MJ, their grips iron tight on the collar of his expensive tailored suit. His head was bowed heavily, his shoulders slumped in total defeat as they marched him down the icy stone steps. The sharp metallic clink of his handcuffs echoed faintly over the roaring wind. They shoved him into the back of a heavily armored FBI SUV. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a sickening thud, permanently trapping the golden child in the harsh reality of his ruined life. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle began its slow, treacherous descent down the mountain, taking my brother away to a federal holding cell. But the true tragedy, the real unvarnished consequence of their arrogance, was unfolding just a few yards away on the snow-packed driveway. The FBI had immediately seized the keys to my parents' luxury vehicles and Chloe's imported sports car. Agent Miller had coldly informed them that the vehicles were classified as criminal assets, purchased with embezzled corporate funds. Now my mother Vivian, my father Richard Sr., and my former sister-in-law Chloe were completely stranded. They had been ordered off the property by federal authorities and were forced to drag their massive, heavy designer suitcases through the ankle-deep slush. The freezing wind whipped mercilessly around them, tearing at their expensive wool coats and ruining their meticulously curated appearances. Vivian was stumbling, her expensive designer heels sinking deep into the freezing mud. Her pristine hair was plastered to her wet face, and her heavy silk dress dragged through the dirty snow. Chloe was walking a few paces behind her, shivering uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around her own chest as she cried silent tears of absolute despair. Her wealthy parents had abandoned her, and now she was trapped in a blizzard with the very people who had dragged her down into the abyss. My father was desperately clutching his gold-plated smartphone, his bare hands turning a sickly shade of blue in the biting cold. I watched him frantically dial the numbers of the African-American elite he had spent decades sucking up to. He called the state senator, who frequently dined at their estate. He called the president of their exclusive country club. He called the wealthy investors he had played golf with just last week. He was begging the screen, desperate for a lifeline, a favor, a private helicopter, anything to save them from this humiliation. But absolutely no one was picking up. The calls went straight to voicemail. Word of MJ's federal indictment had already spread through their high society networks like a fast-moving virus. In the ruthless world of the elite, the Vance family was now completely radioactive. No one was going to risk their own pristine reputation to save a family of exposed frauds. They were social pariahs stripped of their fake billionaire status and left with the ugly reality of their crimes. Forced to face the utter indignity of his situation, my father finally opened a ride-sharing app. I could see the screen glowing weakly in the dark as he hopelessly tried to summon an Uber to a remote mountain estate in the middle of a historic blinding blizzard. He was staring at the spinning loading icon, his shoulders shaking violently from the freezing temperature, realizing that his money, his influence, and his arrogant pride were entirely useless. They were just three desperate people standing in the freezing snow waiting for a cheap sedan that was never going to come. I did not laugh. I did not tap on the glass to mock them. I did not open the door to hurl insults or gloat over their magnificent, humiliating downfall. I simply adjusted my grip on my sleeping son, holding Leo securely against my chest. The rhythmic rising and falling of his small breaths anchored me to the present moment. I rested my chin gently against the top of his head, feeling the soft warmth of his skin. I watched the three of them shiver and stumble in the brutal cold, slipping on the hidden patches of ice, their expensive luggage sinking into the wet snowdrifts. There was no anger left inside me. There was no hatred and no desire for vengeance. There was only a profound, chilling indifference. This was exactly the fate they had condemned me to just hours ago. At the start of this Christmas Eve, they had ruthlessly thrown me and my baby out into this exact storm. They had locked the doors and fully expected us to freeze in the dark, prioritizing their stolen wealth and their toxic golden child over our very survival. They had looked at me shivering with a newborn in my arms and felt absolutely nothing. Now the universe had simply balanced the scales. They were experiencing the exact terror, the exact freezing cold, and the exact profound isolation they had forced upon me. They were reaping the harvest of their own cruelty. My grandmother Estelle stepped up beside me, her presence a silent pillar of absolute strength. She looked out the window, watching her son and her daughter-in-law freezing in the driveway. Her face was completely unreadable, a mask of stoic resolve. She had cut the rod out of her family tree, and she felt no remorse for letting the dead branches fall. We watched the three figures huddled together on the edge of the circular driveway, completely abandoned by the world they thought they ruled. The blizzard was intensifying, the snow falling faster and thicker, quickly covering their designer luggage in a blanket of freezing white. They looked small, pathetic, and entirely insignificant against the massive backdrop of the dark mountain. I turned away from the window, breaking the visual connection to my past. I did not need to watch them suffer to know that I had won. My victory was not in their destruction. My victory was in the warm, sleeping weight of my son in my arms and the absolute peace in my own heart. I walked over to the heavy oak front doors. The freezing draft from outside was seeping through the cracks, carrying the faint sound of the howling blizzard. With one swift, decisive motion, I grabbed the heavy brass handle and pushed the doors completely shut. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt echoed through the silent foyer, a sound of absolute finality. It blocked out the howling wind, the freezing cold, and the toxic people who no longer existed in my world. The lodge fell into a deep, comforting silence. We were safe, we were warm, and we were finally home. The camera slowly pulls back, pulling away from the frozen mountain and the heavy oak doors of the Aspen Lodge. The howling blizzard fades into a soft crackling sound. The harsh, freezing blue light transitions into the warm, golden glow of a roaring fireplace. We are back in the present day, sitting in the expansive living room of the Atlanta mansion. I lean back into my plush leather armchair, adjusting the sleeve of my cashmere sweater. The memories of that brutal Christmas Eve feel distant now, like a movie I watched a lifetime ago. Justice, when delivered with absolute precision, is a remarkably quiet thing. It does not require screaming or dramatics. It only requires the unvarnished truth. And the truth completely annihilated the false empire my family had built. Michael James Vance, the untouchable golden child, the brilliant CEO who could do no wrong, did not last a week in the federal spotlight. The shadow audit I had compiled over 6 months provided the prosecutors with an ironclad, undeniable case. Every forged signature, every illegally leveraged asset, every hidden offshore account was laid bare for the world to see in federal court. MJ tried to negotiate. He tried to charm his way out of the indictments, using that same arrogant smile that had fooled our parents for decades. But federal judges do not care about country club memberships or tailored suits. He was sentenced to 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his corner office and luxury cars for a concrete cell and a standard-issue jumpsuit. There are no investors left to lie to behind bars. His entire identity was stripped away, leaving nothing but a convicted felon. Chloe fared no better. Her ruthless billionaire father kept his exact word. Before MJ was even officially processed into the system, her divorce papers were filed and rushed through the courts. She dropped the Vance name instantly, desperately trying to wash the radioactive stench of federal fraud off her manicured hands. But high society is a vicious, unforgiving arena. The elite circles she used to rule with an iron fist completely shut her out. She was permanently uninvited from the charity galas, removed from the exclusive social boards, and ignored by the very women she used to gossip with over mimosas. Stripped of her independence and her stolen wealth, she crawled back to her parents' estate. She lives there entirely on a strict allowance, treated as an embarrassing liability by her own flesh and blood. She became a ghost haunting a life she no longer possesses any actual power in. As for my parents, Richard Sr. and Vivian, their downfall was swift, absolute, and entirely of their own making. True to my word, I gave them exactly 24 hours to vacate the Atlanta mansion. Without Grandma Estelle's massive trust fund to bail them out, they had absolutely nothing. Their entire lifestyle had been a carefully constructed illusion funded by money they did not earn and credit they could not repay. They were forced to pack whatever meager belongings they legally owned and move into a cramped, dingy two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The country club immediately revoked their membership due to unpaid dues. The politicians and corporate executives my father used to bribe and entertain permanently blocked his phone number. Vivian could no longer afford her daily salon trips or her custom designer gowns. They are living out their days in complete, total obscurity, surrounded by cheap furniture and the suffocating heavy weight of their own massive failures. They chose to protect a thief, and they paid the ultimate price. They lost their money, their fake status, and the only daughter who actually had the power to save them. They are entirely alone. The dust has finally settled. The air is completely clear. The sprawling Aspen Lodge and this magnificent Atlanta estate are now legally entirely in my name. The deeds sit securely in a vault, a permanent physical testament to the fact that I survived their storm. I did not just salvage the family legacy, I completely rebuilt it from the ground up. I now sit at the head of the Obsidian Fund, steering our multi-billion-dollar investments with the precise, absolute integrity that my brother never possessed. The corporate board respects me. The global investors trust me. I do not have to fake a golden persona because the financial returns speak for themselves. I walk into the boardroom every single morning knowing I earned my place at the head of the table. Leo is thriving. He runs through the massive, sunlit halls of this estate with a bright, unburdened laugh. He will never know the toxic, conditional love that poisoned my own childhood. He will never be made to feel small or insignificant or secondary. He is surrounded by warmth, by absolute security, and by the fierce, protective love of a mother who tore down an entire corrupt empire just to keep him safe. And Grandma Estelle remains by my side. She sits across from me at the dinner table, her mind as razor-sharp as ever, her silver-tipped cane resting nearby. We do not talk about MJ or my parents. We do not need to. We successfully and surgically removed the cancer from our family tree, and now the roots are finally allowed to heal and grow deep. She looks at me not with the disappointed glare my parents used to weaponize against me, but with a deep, profound pride. She entrusted me with her life's work, and I secured it perfectly. I shift in my leather armchair, uncrossing my legs. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk touches my lips as I look directly into the camera lens. I reach over to the heavy crystal decanter resting on the polished mahogany side table. The rich amber liquid catches the firelight as I pour a generous measure of aged bourbon into a heavy glass. The ice clinks softly, a sharp, pleasant sound ringing out in the quiet, peaceful room. I lift the glass, holding it up in a silent mock toast to the ghosts of my past. They threw me out into the freezing cold because they truly believed I did not deserve a seat at their table. They thought I was weak. They thought I was entirely disposable. I take a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, letting the intense warmth spread deeply through my chest. But they did not know. I did not need a seat at their pathetic table. I bought the whole damn house. Merry Christmas.